Okay. Oh, the lights are coming. All right. So, good evening, everyone. So good to see everyone back. And we're just gonna, is there announcements or something? Okay. I just wanted to spend this time just for any questions and things that are coming up. We were starting a really good conversation at the tail end of dinner, which is why I was late. Well, I don't want to blame anyone. I just kind of, lost track of time. And everyone was watching me, thinking that they were going to leave with me, but I was late. You never watch me for anything. This is a rule in my community. Don't ask me about details about any program. When something starts, when something ends, I have people who do that. Some of you know that already. So, Michael, So I don't have Sister Sadada with me, so Sister Sadada is always on time. No theme music. We were just talking about that at dinner just now. We were just talking about accessibility and inclusivity and the presentation of Dharma. I'll just start there, and then we'll just open up the space with that, just to continue. Um, you know, just about teaching and the presentation of Dharma, right? And how do you engage different generations and different communities, right? And I was saying, one of the things I was saying is that I come with this really interesting mix of identities where I'm naturally going to engage a lot of different communities just by people seeing me, right? So that's already working for me. But even further than that, I was just saying that like I'm someone who's interested in culture and society. I'm interested in history and arts, right? And I naturally bring that into my teaching, right? I'm a person in the world. And I think sometimes Dharma can be presented, and depends on the lineage and the tradition as well, because some lineages are heavily monastic based. I would say Vipassana, insight, even Zen, to an extent, is very monastic, very traditional. Tibetan Buddhism too, but I didn't find that to be a huge issue with me in my training. But this kind of overemphasis on monasticism really can create an expression of Dharma that feels really rigid, unaccessible, right? Which is not saying that there's nothing wrong with that, right? Dharma is Dharma, but it depends on what your purpose is and where you're teaching. So if you're teaching in a place or in a community and you're not mirroring the identity of that community as a teacher, then that's going to create a disconnect. So I can't go back to Atlanta or to the community that I was raised in monastic robes, right? And just have a very stoic presentation in the same way that I was taught by my teachers who were Tibetan. My root teachers were Tibetan, most of them have passed, right? That's not going to work, right? And I was very fortunate too, because my root teacher, Lama Rod Rinpoche, who I've written about in my books, was as a kind of elder Tibetan master, who created a lot of trouble, too. But an elder master who immigrated here, escaped Tibet, was interned in the concentration camp by the communists, escaped the communists, the concentration camp, the work camp, hiked over the Himalayas, right? Ended up in India and was sent to America, to New York, particularly to start a community. That's a lot of experience that I don't understand already, right? And then I come along, and I was his first black teacher, his first black student to become a teacher. And people would tell me, You know, they're like, you realize you're the first. You know, how could I know? I've never seen a black llama. You know, like that's weird. That's impossible to believe. But anyhow, and after I finished my training, you know, he was like, listen, you're black. I was like, okay. I was like, where's this going? And then he goes, no, you're black. You're gonna reach people that I'm not gonna reach. There are people who are gonna look at me and not take me seriously, but there are people who are gonna look at you and say, what do you have to say? Right? He was like, you know, you have to be aware of that. You have to be aware of how you present in the world because that's part of your dharma. You know, a lot. I've not heard a lot of like elder teachers like that communicate to students across generations and identities like that in such a specific, direct way that you are a certain person in the world and you need to take that seriously because you can use that to teach. You know, and so from very early on, that was how I was being asked to think. You know, I'm not a Buddhist, right? I'm just not a Buddhism. Being a Buddhist or a Dharma practitioner isn't just like this complete kind of identity that erases everything else. It's one of many identities in my intersectionality. You know, sometimes I think it's the strongest, sometimes I don't think it's that strong, but it's still a part of an intersectionality, and I allow other identity locations to exert themselves. And when I started doing that, then my presentation of Dharma began to change. Like, I'm deeply rooted in my lineage, in my tradition. Like, I'm extremely well trained, both, you know, in terms of practice, monastic experience, as well as academic training in Buddhism. Like, so that's there. But because that rootedness, that depth is there, I can have a lot of fun in how I present Dharma, right? Because the depth isn't going anywhere. Like if you read my books, you know, I'm deeply involved in culture. I'm deeply involved in things that we're involved in. And I bring that into the Dharma. I'm like, well, look at this movie. You know, I remember the days, you know, in sessions where I would go off and do like a 2 hour talk on the Matrix. You know, I've let that go because that takes a lot of energy and time, but people used to love it, you know, or TV shows and music. You know, it's like, this is what you're watching. Let's talk about it. That's why I'm always, you know, more recently talking about the White Lotus. Let's talk about that. That's a very relevant Buddhist media that's very like, you know, it's nuanced and very subtle. So let's talk about it. You know, if you know whatever you're involved in, bring a dharmic lens into it. You know, and there's some teaching there. You know, to unearth. But so the two types of teaching, as we were talking about earlier at dinner, is the teaching of Dharma about Dharma and Dharma about the world. Right? And this is a little bit of my pet peeve right here, you know, but Dharma about Dharma, there's nothing wrong with that. So when I say Dharma about Dharma, I'm like, okay, let's talk about love and compassion. Let's talk about the four boundless qualities or the four Brahma Viharas. Let's talk about, you know, the refuge prayer. You know, that's Dharma about Dharma. That's important, right? But the other kind of Dharma that I really enjoy doing is Dharma about the world. So let's talk about love and compassion as you live next door to a neighbor who likes to fly a Trump flag. Let's talk about what Dharma means then, right? Let's talk about Dharma, you know, having to deal with, you know, addiction, you know, or dealing with what anything, you know, that's concerning life. You know, what is the dharma of this moment of fascism? and authoritarianism, right? What is the dharma of sexual expression and sexual fluidity, and gender fluidity, right? What is that dharma like, right? When I say dharma, I'm really specifically using dharma to talk about wisdom, the clarity. What is the clarity? The clarity that helps us to reduce harm, to reduce violence, and to remember our ultimate nature, right? And how do you do that being in the world right now? What is the dharma of grieving, right? And that's the kind of work that I do. Those are the kind of books that I write. But my first book was Radical Dharma, like with Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, Dr. Yasmin Saidullah, and that was Black Lives Matter. Essentially, the dharma of Black Lives Matter, because that's how the book started. Or that's how our conversation started. It was like, what are we going to do in this moment, this age of Ferguson? That very summer, it was like, okay, we're Black Dharma teachers. Like, what is our response? And what is our contribution to this new movement? And that was Radical Dharma, right? So that's what I'm talking about, Dharma about the world, right? And then Love and Rage, we're pissed off, you know? And what are we going to do about it? What's the Dharma of anger? How is Dharma liberatory? How is Dharma, or rather, how is anger liberatory? How is anger intersectional? How is anger influenced by cultures, gender, sexuality, race, and so forth, right? And of course, my current book, New Saints, right, which is like this whole other thing, which is like, what's the Dharma for right now? What's the rearticulation of the Bodhisattva path in a way that's accessible? Again, accessibility being language, being references, being voice, It's not Dharma about Dharma, but it's an innovation, on these really old, ancient, practices or belief structures and so forth, right? But as teachers, right, we have to be willing to take risks, right? You have to take a lot of risks. And most of those risks are about vulnerability. And a lot of teachers don't know how to be vulnerable. I think that's rooted within the training of lineages, and traditions. I would say in the Vipassana insight tradition, which I've taught a lot in, it was always like, well, Rod, we don't talk about ourselves. We're not self-referential. You don't say, you don't talk about the ways that you struggle with practice because that creates doubt for practitioners. And you may be forcing people to do emotional labor for you. And I can see that. I can see how we can use the cushion and the teacher's seat to emote and call it practice and then kind of force people to do emotional labor for us. But I would always push back and say, well, like, I'm not interested in a teacher who doesn't disclose their struggle in practice, because I think it's untruthful to present a dharma that lacks struggle, because everyone struggles. Even the Buddha struggled in practice. And as a practitioner, if I can't hear that from a teacher, then that's a sign that I am still working through my kind of spiritual maturity to hold that, you know. But I am very, I would say, confessional. I'm a confessionalist, and I write about topics and experiences that are can be very controversial and very edgy on purpose, not because I'm trying to be interesting, because you need to see how I, as a Dharma teacher, as a long-term practitioner, an advanced practitioner, deals with these issues in my practice around sexuality, around desire, around body, right? And fatness, and neurodivergency. Like, you have to see how I wrestle with that. You have to understand the doubts that I can have, right? And that's truth telling, right? And it doesn't serve you for me just kind of get in front of you and talk about, how wonderful Dharma is. Dharma is wonderful, but it's not always fun, right? And I want to talk about those times when it's not fun or interesting, when you would rather be doing something else. How do we practice then? You know, People, especially right now in the world, need to relate to their spiritual teachers in a really human way, not for teachers to maintain or sit on a pedestal that takes them out of really disclosing their struggle right now. I think that's a power thing as well. You can exert a lot of power and dominance over people if you get them to believe that you're kind of perfect, right? And I think a lot of teachers get off on that as well. One joke that we used to pass around, particularly about Dharma teachers, is that and we used to say this about the Zen practitioners, because, Zen communities turn out teachers. Tibetans, it takes a while for us to to hit the seat. But we used to say, oh, there are all these people, particularly guys, young men, who like no one ever paid attention to them until they started practicing Buddhism and got their transmission. And then all of a sudden, they get this attention and they don't know how to hold it, right? And you run into all these issues around power and authority. You don't know how to hold people's kind of spiritual vulnerability because actually you haven't trained enough to hold yours, or there's a deep insecurity that you haven't tended to, and being a teacher really opens that up, and you start manipulating people around you to get that insecurity met, right? And that's happening all the time, and I write about that. I write about teacher-student misconduct, and abuse, and I try to I just kind of break it down as much as I can from my experience, how this happens, right? But there's so many people who come to the teacher seat who actually shouldn't be on the teacher seat, right? You can have profound Dharma training and practice, but it doesn't make you a teacher, right? And particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, we have texts that talk about, okay, what is an ideal teacher? There has to be a balance of, knowledge about the Dharma. That has to be balanced with an in-depth practice, right? Both of those have to be present. But in our current context, there also has to be training around ethics, right? There has to be training around, inclusivity and things like that, like these things that, you learn, in divinity school, in seminaries and so forth, right? But we, yeah, the Dharma about the world and the Dharma about Dharma, it really, for me, reveals where people are as teachers. Like what do you have the capacity to talk about? And I'm not saying to be on the teacher seat, you have to be an expert, right? But even though you may not be an expert, right, I'm still not hearing people say, well, I don't know, or that's not my experience, which is also a teaching. But I don't even hear teachers saying that sometimes. I hear people trying to give advice on things that they have no idea about, and that ends up creating harm. Instead of saying, I don't know, it's like, instead, I'm just going to pretend like I know something, but I'm going to say something that's actually really dismissive and not really kind, and call it Dharma, right? And we have to be careful about that, as well. Some of us may have. This is another thing that I say too. People come to me and they're like, well, I asked a certain teacher about some real intense thing, right? And I say, okay, has this teacher ever offered any evidence as to if they can actually talk about this issue? And they're like, no. Then why did you do that? Right? Why are you asking a teacher about, I don't know, queerness if they never said a word about queerness? Now, I would ask my teacher, but I wouldn't ask him what he thought. because I was like, you don't actually know what it's like to be a queer black man in America. And then he would look at me and, well, I wouldn't ask him about it, but I would say, can I talk about certain things? And then he would say, of course. If it's your experience, you can talk about it, you know? And I was like, great. And I kind of ran with that. So everything that I talk about, I got consent to talk about. I mean, I got permission from my teacher to talk about, right? He was like, just talk about anything that's important to talk about, you know? So I come from my own experience around that, right? So therefore, a lot of people come to me and ask me all kinds of questions. I've gotten all kinds of questions. And most of the time I'm like, yeah, I've done that before. Here's what I think. It's just like it's not a lot I haven't done, right? And as someone who is again involved in culture and life and living, like when I became a Buddhist, I didn't. Yeah, I was monastic for the duration of my training, but I'm not a lifelong monastic. You know, um, I am involved in spaces and practices, and I take my dharma with me. That's the rule, right? And another rule that I have is that I don't do anything that I can't talk about or write about in a book. And the result of that is I write about a lot of stuff. One would say I have no more shame, and it still hurts. Like the particularly in New Saints, there's a chapter in there that hurts putting down on paper, right? But I have to do that because that's what I owe my dharma is that continuous investigation, that interrogation. Dharma has to get into everything. Even if it was the past before I came into Dharma, Dharma has to go and time travel back to these times and places for me to start making sense of who I used to be. That's the kind of work that I do as a teacher, and that creates a lot of openness and inclusivity, right? So, you know, my community tends to be very young, you know, very queer, very trans, you know, as well, and we just kind of roll with it. I always call it sometimes the refugee community because there's a lot of people coming from all kinds of traditions who don't feel at home, but they end up doing whatever I'm doing, and they're like, okay, this isn't Zen, but like it's still Dharma, so here we go, right? And that's what I try to focus on. But that is also the practice of being authentic in myself, being myself, right? And Lama Willa Baker was a part of that for me. He's one of my oldest teachers with the Natural Dharma Fellowship up in New Hampshire. You know, early on, she helped me get into retreat to train to be a Lama. And then after retreat, she was someone who was like, you have to be yourself. Because I remember very much moving through a period in my early teaching years of just like being confused. Like, who am I supposed to be? Like, all these identities were coming together. I was like, should I be the Lama? Should I be Rod? Who am I the activist still? And what am I? Right? And she was just like, relax. Just choose the presentation, the expression that feels very natural and freeing. And that's what I chose to do and start practicing. And so doing that means that I continuously evolve because I'm always changing. Like I'm a very different person. I would say, Grace, you've known me the longest, like at least 10 years. Yeah, longer than yeah, and so it's just like, oh, like look at how I've changed over the years. Yeah, yeah, like it's because I say yes to the change. I changed a lot in the pandemic. I was like, oh, like I have to like upgrade. Like this is like the apocalypse is happening. I was like, okay, I have to change. What does that look like? What does it feel like? And I engaged in that. And that opened up a lot of different doors, right? And that gave rise to New Saints. New Saints is like, okay, this is the catalog of how I've changed since Love and Rage and Radical Dharma, right? And you have to, I think as a teacher, you have to always say yes to change, right? Because change is always happening. That's impermanence, you know? But if you say yes to it, if you keep riding with it and dancing with it, you'll stay relevant, you know? And it's not about age. It's not about, oh, all these young people, you know. No, it's not about that. Like authenticity is timeless, right? Being yourself is timeless. And being proud of your authentic self, it carries so much weight. Like we long for authentic, truthful people, you know? Like who who watched White Lotus this last season? Have you gotten to the end? Okay, so okay, no spoilers. No spoilers. Um, One of the things, there are two things I really like about the show. It's Parker Posey's character and family, who kind of mirrors my family because they were saying the same things to me when I was deciding to join the monastery. They were like, "You're not Asian, you're Christian." I was like, "My God, how did this writer know?" And then when I was joining the monastery, the same thing. My mom and dad, who are not together and haven't been together for many years, they were like, "We have to come and see this place." So they're coming and hanging out the monastery. My dad was doing like surveillance work. He had a camera. I was like, "Why do you have a camera?" And my dad worked for the Pentagon at the time. So like so I was like, "Okay, do whatever you need to do." I'm sure he ran a background check. You know, and all of that. And even at the very end, the night before I went into 3-year retreat, my dad had exhausted everything. You know, then finally he was like, "Why don't you try it? And if you don't like it, leave." And the same thing happened in the show, right? If you haven't gotten there, you know. But Parker Posey is like, "Listen, go." She tells her daughter. So in the show, if you don't know the show, the daughter, there's a family. It takes place in Thailand. It's heavy Buddhist themes, a lot of teaching. I'm going to get to that in a second. And there's a family there and a young daughter in this family who wants to join a 1-year meditation program at the local Thai temple, you know. And so her family comes to check everything out. And the family's just like, they're from Durham. And I teach a lot in Durham, you know. So I was like, I get that, you know. And they were like doing everything that they could to keep the daughter from making this decision. And then finally Parker Posey was like, "Why don't you just spend the night at the monastery?" You know, because she's like, "Well, you know, you love comfort. This isn't comfortable." And that's what my dad tried to do with me at the end. He was like, "Well, you know, you're not going to like this because this is too extreme." And I loved it. Right. So that's one thing about the White Lotus. But the second thing is the teaching. And this is the point that I'm making actually about authenticity. The teacher in that, the monk, right? This really intense show, and here you have this master giving this like Dharma talk to different characters, and how beautiful that talk was, and how much himself he was as a character in that. And he wasn't trying to like, you know, like he wasn't necessarily trying to like relate or do anything special. He was like, "This is who I am, and this is what I practice," and how that broke through culture and language to the characters who were coming from, you know, from here, you know, with all of their baggage and all their stuff, right? And that's what I'm talking about. You know, you don't have to be hip and cool, you have to be pure in your dharma, right? And that can communicate directly, right? But the other thing is, like, I wish show producers would realize that Pema Chodron isn't the only Buddhist teacher in the world. Like, how many books does she sell with that show? Like, because the characters is like, "I'm interested in Buddhism," and all of a sudden, "Start Where You're At" appears in the show, you know? And like characters are holding the book and flashing, and I'm like, that's like obvious, you know. You know, product placement. I'm like, how much? You know, but she doesn't take the money. The money goes to Campo Abbey, so it's not her money, you know. So I guess that's good. But if you see my book in a show, that's coming to me, by the way. So But yeah, just open up. I just want to open up, the space for any questions from today, from earlier, any questions about the discussion, as well. Humor too. Like you can crack jokes. I don't think a lot of teachers have senses of humor. My sense of humor tends to be very dry. Sometimes I enjoy dry humor, so it confuses people. They're like, "Are you serious?" I say, if you want to laugh, just laugh. You know. Um, but I think that's important, not to take yourself so seriously. As well. Here's a microphone for anyone. Yeah.
Do a jog.
Which chapter in New Saints was so painful for you to?
The letting go of the lover I used to be, which the last two chapters, right? Letting go of the lover I used to be and Karmapa Think of Me. Karmapa Think of Me wasn't as hard. It just took me a long time to write. That's some of the oldest writing in the book. Because, we're not trained to publicly criticize the leaders of our schools. But I have made it a habit. So, you know, because no one is above accountability. Even some people are saying that wasn't enough, but I did the best that I could. Because you have to balance. You have to balance real love for someone who has taught you a lot and in a way saved your life with the reality of the harm of their actions. And I think sometimes trauma dictates this thing where we want to cover over the truth with our hurt. And it was the same thing with my teacher, Nola Rinpoche, in Love and Rage. And I wrote Karmapa Think of Me as a response to Love and Rage, because, a lot of folks in Love and Rage were saying, well, you didn't go far enough. You didn't make it accessible for people outside of the lineage, outside of the tradition. So I didn't really explore devotion. And so people didn't understand why I cared, or they didn't understand how I could still love someone who's created harm. And I didn't get into the devotion. So in New Saints, with the Karmapa, I had to get into the devotion. Like, what is the science of devotion as we hold and tell the truth about harm and the complexities of that, right? And then, so in New Saints, but that was easy. That was pretty easy because that's something I've been wrestling with for years. But letting go of the lover I used to be is this exploration of really, in many ways, sexual based trauma that I've survived and been a part of, right? And that was really hard because it's really hard to write about trauma, and to write through trauma. So that took a long time. That took a lot of wrestling. That took a lot of just working through things and telling the truth. And I always say that, like, the point of that chapter wasn't for me to look good. It was for me to tell the truth, you know? And that's the price you pay for Dharma. The Dharma demands the truth. And you have to be willing to offer that truth, over and over again. If you can't do that, then I don't know if we can call ourselves Dharma practitioners, right? And that's painful. Like, the truth is such a painful process to be in relationship with, but we have to keep showing up to it, right? And this is why, as I was saying earlier today, it's like we have to be clear about why we're doing this, right? If you're here just to feel good, then this is not a sustainable practice, right? But if you're here to get free, then you're going to understand that, like, this liberation work is going to take a lot of discomfort to get through, right? But you have to see the discomfort as a medicine. You have to see it as a teacher as well, or it's just going to be an obstacle, you know? So, yep. In the back here.
Yeah,
Oh,
you had mentioned earlier, help me understand this term. I haven't heard this before. To force people to do emotional labor for us.
yes.
Can you unpack that for
Oh
me?
yeah. You know, someone who's really good to read is oh, what's her name? Who does the shame? Yeah, Brene Brown. So I started learning this with Brene Brown's work around vulnerability. But she writes about this whole phenomena where we can emotionally manipulate people by being vulnerable, and emotional. And she says that's kind of the shadow of vulnerability. We can weaponize our vulnerability to to get what we want, right? I think the same thing can happen. Like when we're being vulnerable as a teacher, we can we can kind of like trigger certain reactions and certain responses from people that tends to our unmet needs around attention, you know, and emotional, kind of holding. Right. And so I talk a lot about and Love and Rage was a whole book about my emotions, right? About suffering, about trauma and anger and how where all that's rooted. But I tell people I didn't write that book to force you to feel bad about me. I wrote that book to show you how I process this and use Dharma. That's the difference that I'm talking about. I can talk about my emotional work. I can talk about my own suffering, but I am holding that experience for myself. I'm framing that with Dharma. So as I talk about that, I'm saying, and this is what I'm doing. You can feel that. That's a difference there when people are just compared to people sitting on the cushion and just saying, I had like a shit day and, I'm just like, things are just terrible, you know? But there's no sense of holding that experience, being with that experience. They're just emoting. And that forces people who care, right? We all care about the teacher. That forces us to get emotionally involved, which takes us out of our practice, right? But to offer your experience that you're having in the moment as a teacher and to say, okay, here's what I'm experiencing. What are you experiencing? How are you practicing with this right now? How do you practice when you go through similar situations that I'm going through, right? And that's how you frame that as a teacher in a way that doesn't feel so manipulative, you know. But there's a fine line there too. I think there's a nuance, and I get what and Sharon Salzberg too has been very vocal about this as well. Like she's been like, we have to be careful as teachers not to do this. But I think that you can hit an extreme where you're like, well, I'm not going to disclose anything. I wish there was like some interest in the real lives of Dharma teachers. So, like on one hand, is it will be very boring, but then on the other hand, I think it would be really interesting because there are a lot of like really well-known Dharma teachers who are performing a version of themselves for you all. That I'm not messy enough to disclose that. But I'm like, oh, okay, that teacher wrote that book and they're doing something completely different in their private lives. Okay, but that's not my work to disclose that, right? That's not my business. Um, yeah, yeah. You have a question in the back? Oh, great. Oh, great, great.
In seminary, I was trained that you can preach from your scars, but not from your wounds.
Yes.
And so I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I like that. I haven't heard it framed like that. But yeah, the scars, because yeah, the scars is like it indicates healing. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. You're teaching from the lessons, from the wisdom of that healing and that work, and the woundedness. Yeah, you're in it. You know. Yes, exactly. And that switches the roles, and so that like you're showing up to caretake instead of being taken care of. And I there's one teacher that I'm close to who I consider a teacher. I mean, they are my teacher, but they're in a different kind of spiritual community, and they're really struggling right now because they believe that at some point, after all these years of dedication to the community, that the community should be taking care of them, right now, and it's created a lot of hurt for that teacher. And it's hard for me to communicate, well, it's not why we show up, but they just feel like they have given over and over and over for decades in this community. And when they need help, like they feel like they've been abandoned and let go of. And that's when, as we learn as ministers, that we have to have very strong networks of colleagues where we're supporting each other. It's not necessarily appropriate for me to rely on students for emotional labor, right? I have colleagues and friends who do that, and that's important to have, right? I try, you have to be careful about showing up with needs, and being clear about those needs and being clear about disrupting the ways in which you may manipulate the congregation or the community to get those needs met. There are things that, yes, we agree on to support clergy and teachers, like, salaries and stuff like that, right? But after that, it becomes ethical misconduct. Of course, that's the difference. The specificities are different, depending on, the paths. For denominations, for like mainstream denominations, taking care of the teacher looks a little different than particularly traditional Buddhist communities. So those are really interesting conversations to have. When I was in divinity school, the difference of cultures, but still, there's still ethics, even, in Buddhist communities. Yeah, there's a lot more care that happens for the teacher, but there's still ethical guidelines that we have to be very clear about, as well. Online. Oh. Look at that.
Hi, thank you. My name is Annie, and I'm the facilitator, I guess, of the practice group in Albany, New York. And one of my question is, the group that I meet with on a regular basis now, every week people come and they are they're taking everything that's going on in this country very personally. Yeah. They're sad, they're hurt, and they're in pretty extreme pain. And we've done a lot with holding space for folks, and a lot about the fact that we need to engage in self-care, that's really, really, really important at a time like this. But I just don't know if you have any particular suggestions where people feel like really personally hurt because of what the president is doing about Ukraine, or, they're big issues, but they feel like it's hurting their own hearts,
Well,
like all day, and
yeah.
it's painful.
Yeah, it's moral injury too. That's another part of what's happening for folks. And I think that's new for a lot of people. It's not so new, particularly for like veterans, which is where this work began around moral injury. But moral injury is the hurt that we feel when we feel as if our ethics, our moral, kind of boundaries have been disrupted. So it's like, yeah, you live in a country that's creating genocides, wars, and it has since its beginning. Like America just does what it's always done, right? But when you start learning more about that, you're like, how is this being done? I don't believe in that. That's not what I support, but we are. We pay taxes. We are supporting it, right? And so that feels very personal right now. So that's the moral injury. And I would say a couple of things. And there are two things, actually. One thing that relates back to our discussion earlier, which is the personal piece of this. But I'll get to that in a second. But I want to address this question directly. Like, what do we do? Right? I think one of the first things that we're doing is we're recognizing that the community, the Sangha, just this group that maybe we get together once a week, and do practice, right? Maybe more. that's going to be very limited, you know? So an hour, hour and a half, 2 hour meditation session isn't going to fulfill all the needs that people are really needing right now, right? But we can still do what we can. And this is why, yeah, you were talking about self-care, absolutely. But there's also, let me break this down even more. Um, we all have to be really active around gathering resources that are outside of the Sangha as well. So people can't just come to Sangha and say, that's going to be all of my emotional support and spiritual support. Like there has to be other ways to do that. There has to be communities and groups outside of Sangha that we're a part of, therapies, modalities, healing work. I would say that's all a part of self-care, right? But we have to be supported and tended to outside of Sangha because Sangha is not a therapeutic community. It's a spiritual community. And I think we toe the line or even cross the line sometimes. There's a lot of intersection around mental health therapies and Dharma. And I'm definitely in that intersection. I spend a lot of time there. But I'm not a therapist, right? And the line for me is that, like, as a spiritual, spiritual teacher, trained minister, what have you, I have to be very clear around like spiritual support and guidance. Like, how do you use the teachings to get clear about decisions? Not how do I use the teachings to diagnose you? Like, and that's the difference. I'm not diagnosing you. I'm just helping you to use the teachings, the practice, to create some openness, some space, right? So that helps you to make other decisions around your care and your practice. But we have to realize in sanghas that there's only so much that we can do as a community, and we can encourage people to create and gather resources outside of the sangha as well. So that's a big thing too. And I think in sangha, I think it's important to look at different kinds of practices. Like I'm just saying that maybe it's not that we just get together, we talk about Dharma, we have some meditation. Maybe we expand what we do. Maybe we do some grief work. Maybe we do some somatic work, which is very, very dharmic based as well. I do a lot of grief work in the world, and that's again a response. Like that's my expression of spiritual care and support is by offering grieving practices based in the Dharma, and mindfulness and somatic work, right? And that can be really great to invite someone to come in and to offer sessions like that and to help people build their tool bag around coping and managing what's going on, and to know that it's just going to be overwhelming. No matter how much we do, it's just going to be super overwhelming for all of us, right? And that's when we have to hold on tight but gently to our sources of refuge, right? And community is a part of that. Our teachers, our teachings, or anything that feels supportive, we just hold on to it and just try to get through it, right? This is a very different period, right? So not all of us are going to make it through this period, and that has to be okay. Right? So one of my favorite Dharma teachings that those of you who follow me already probably know it is from a very great, profound teacher named Whitney Houston. One of my favorites. And where she says it's not right, but it's okay. Right. And I think that's part of our moral injury kind of work. Like this isn't right, but it's happening. And how can I be in a relationship to that? And when I say okay, it's not like, oh, it's not condoning, but it's telling the truth, right? That things are going to happen outside of my consent. And how do I witness that and hold space for that as it's happening? Because many of us do feel quite helpless right now. hmm hmm And many of us do feel super, super helpless. How do you hold that helplessness? How do you keep showing up and witnessing the suffering that's happening all over, right? And there are things that we're witnessing that the news and media isn't even touching. And that's even harder, right? To feel invisible, to feel like you're being ignored and erased. How do you hold that? And the communities who are being erased and ignored, especially being a part of those communities, right? So it's not right, right? But it's happening, right? And this is one of the things that we're contemplating on to generate a renunciation of samsara. Like, as in the Tibetan tradition, the translation of the work around samsara is contemplating the defects of samsara. The downfall of samsara. Like, why? Like, why are we trying to transcend this? What's the problem? And this is the problem. There will always be suffering, right? And there will always be this conflict. There will always be this tension, right? Until we start getting clear about what we are, right? So we generate a renunciation that says, I will cultivate and awaken compassion and wisdom to remember who I am. And in doing so, I will help others, right? And so that takes me back, right, to this other question. Well, not to the question, but something else that came up in the question, which is taking things personally. And this is related to the bodhisattva, right? So the bodhisattva, these more expressed, higher level bodhisattvas don't take things personally like we do. It's not personal anymore. So when they become the medicine, it's not a preference as to what they become. They are shaped by the needs of those who need them. Instead of saying, oh, I'm just going to become this thing, and you're just going to have to deal with it, right? Because once you get so much space around the ego, you're like, oh, I can just become whatever. I have no preference anymore, right? I will become what the beings need me to become. Right. So we think about, one of the people that I study is Harriet Tubman. And I write about Harriet Tubman and teach about her all the time. I'm always teaching about Harriet Tubman. But in my world of spiritual abolition, right, we see Harriet Tubman as a very realized being, as a realized bodhisattva, who emanated in her last life as a black woman slave. Not because she chose that, it's because that's what she needed to be to do the work. Right? And I was like, wow. Right? But it wasn't personal. Yes, it was hard, but it wasn't personal anymore. Right? Because as a higher level bodhisattva who's getting, super close to awakening, it's just like, no, like this is a dream. I'm going to take on the form that I need to take on to be of benefit in the dream. Because the dream is less than a second, right? Like, what is life, right? So that's the kind of awareness that the bodhisattva kind of embodies over time. Like, they have a different experience of reality than we do. And that's what makes their work so intense. Well, it looks like it's so intense. But you wonder, okay, what is their actual experience in the moment? Right? I talk a lot about Jesus as well. I talk a lot about Jesus and the New Saints. There's a lot of theology in the New Saints. It's my pop theology, from my handful of classes in divinity school, but, in theology. But I try to make it work. It's my root practice, right? Christianity. So I have some authority. But I talk about Jesus like the choice that Jesus made to enter into, the crucifixion, as tomorrow is Palm Sunday. And so we're, moving into Easter. And we ask, okay, how can someone choose to be sacrificed when they're this powerful? Like, what's the point of that? And I think the first thing that we recognize is that for me, Jesus was a bodhisattva, an advanced bodhisattva. So his relationship to his body was very different, right? I think there was a deeper remembrance of what he was, which makes choices like that much easier, right? The suffering is still there, absolutely, but relationship to the body is different, right? And so that's important to always think about. You think about great change makers that we know and love, like for instance, Dr. King, who I think was also a very high level bodhisattva as well. Very different relationship, right? I think he came here to do something specific, and when it was done, he was like, okay, I'm returning back to my state, right? Was he a victim? I don't know. I don't think so. There's high level bodhisattvas have a lot of agency, right? And they can do a lot of things, right? I think this is just, I just want to put that out there because I think sometimes we get afraid of some of these teachings around, okay, the bodhisattva is going to like emanate and do all this stuff. You're like, whoa, I don't think so, But when you take into consideration that you begin to really know and believe and understand that you're much more than the physical body, that you're connected to emptiness and have this expansive mind, I think that creates a different situation of, this realm, right? And so, and I'll say this and we'll continue. When you say yes to getting free, when you say yes to really benefiting beings, when that becomes an authentic choice, you will receive all the resources that you need, right? You may be sitting there going, I'm so limited, right? But when you actually consent to liberation work for all beings, then the red carpet will roll out for you. The universe will say it's about time. Dare I mention the Matrix? It's can I go there, right? I'll just say this, right? In the Matrix, right? When they're doing the loading program, they go into this complete blank space and then everything rolls out. They're like, okay, just grab everything that you need before you get uploaded into the program. Like, that's it. Like, once you say yes and become intentional about the work, all the spiritual technology will roll out. But as long as you're resisting, you're going to feel very limited, right? I really guarantee that. I absolutely guarantee that. Once you start to really say yes, right? You may be a practitioner, right? Have been maybe for many decades, but I wonder if you've really consented to the overall project of Buddha Dharma, which is freedom, which is transcending the cycle of birth and rebirth, right? The overall project of Buddha Dharma isn't to become a bodhisattva, actually. The project is to get free, is to obtain enlightenment. And so the bodhisattva path is something that we consent to, as we recognize that there's something that's owed, right? As we're getting more and more free, we feel an obligation in a way to give back to others what's been given to us because we haven't gotten free on our own. It's come with the support of other beings, other communities, right? So the bodhisattva choice is just the recognition that you're a part of a cycle, and you're invited to return these medicines back, right? Because the Buddha didn't even want to teach. After his awakening, he had to be convinced, right? Because he was like, no one's going to get this. And then these beings and spirits and deities showed up. They were like, you don't have a choice. You consented to this. Like, you came here to awaken, to teach, right? Which is why in many of our traditions we have prayers for the bodhisattvas to remain, to stay active and engaged, right? And we do this in Tibetan Buddhism. Traditionally, the beginning of the teachings is a whole litany of prayers that we go through. And prayers to the bodhisattvas is one of those prayers. And for years, I wondered, like, why do we have to beg the bodhisattvas to stay? Shouldn't they just stay? But as I've gotten older, I've realized the more awakened you get, the more you realize that you don't have to be here. Like, there's a real struggle and a suffering. And you're like, wait, I can just return back to this state instead of hovering around here dealing with hard-headed people. Thus, we pray to the bodhisattvas. No matter how difficult we are, please stay. This also explains the kind of eccentric, intense behavior of really realized beings, masters, right? Because the rules change. Like, they're not bound by the same rigid rules that we are because they no longer believe in this, because they get this, they understand this to be a dream. And the more realized you become, the more you really start lucid dreaming, right? So you have this agency to make choices, to move through this experience, right? And so you kind of get a little untamed, right? Which makes sense, right? When you have all this space to be in, you're going to take it up. You're going to be all over the place. Whereas most of us, our lives are just like living in a closet. Our boundaries are well defined. We don't get to go far because we believe in those walls, those boundaries. And I talk about this in New Saints as well, so you can read about this kind of analogy. But like our limits are very present, but the more you awaken, the more you stop believing in those boundaries so you can expand. And it's hard to create a sense of boundaries and limitations when there's so much potential, right? And this is why community is really important for teachers, right? Particularly really realized teachers, right? Is that we have to create boundaries and accountability structures for teachers because they need that. Like, the more awakened a teacher is, the more boundaries and tethering that they need, right? And I fear that hasn't happened in communities in the past as much as it should have. Like, Trungpa Rinpoche is one of those examples. Like, people can celebrate his activity, but that activity, it wasn't held, right? There was no resistance, no pushback, no accountability. It's like, oh, this person is awakened and realized, so they get to do whatever they want, even if it is abusive, right? And that's part of our spiritual maturity in this culture, in this country as well. Like, we have a long ways to go to understand how to be in relationship to that kind of spiritual awakening, and that we can push back, right? And we can say no, and we can question. And this is why I try to write about in my work. It's like, yeah, you can have a realized master as a teacher, or you can have a guru, even though that may be a problematic word as well, but we have to have agency. Like, we just can't keep giving our agency away because we think someone is super realized and magical and awakened, right? My teachers, my Tibetan teachers are quite realized, but I still talk back. I still write chapters about them in But anyway, let's continue. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all your wisdom with us. And if I can just respond very super briefly to that previous question. If you're a lay leader who's leading a Sangha and you're finding folks have this extra pastoral care need, do please reach out to your minister. They can really help with that kind of thing. But go ahead.
Oh yeah, that's taking into account that there is,
if there is one, yeah.
If there's like lay communities and it's just like community led, it's harder.
Totally.
My
actual question for you, I appreciate that you've been bringing up White Lotus, and there's another show that's been out recently called Severance.
Yes. Oh, don't get me started.
Well, and this is exactly what I want to ask you about. So if for those who haven't seen it, there's this procedure in this show where you can basically bifurcate your memories so that when you're at work, you have one awareness, and when you're out in your personal life, you have another awareness.
And you get that early on. That's like the first 5 or 10 minutes.
That's
of the
the premise of the show. Yeah, that's not a spoiler. That's the whole thing. But I think that Severance, very, very good. they use it as a way to separate themselves from
Yep.
suffering.
Yep.
And one of the episodes in the most recent season is even called Chakai Bardo,
Yeah.
which is a Buddhist concept.
Yeah.
I'll probably know that. So I was wondering, because they do that, this way of detaching themselves from suffering, but in an unhealthy way.
Yeah.
I think in some UU communities, I've seen folks try to use Buddhist techniques
Yeah.
to like spiritually bypass.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if you could speak on that a little bit.
Absolutely. Can you say more about like some specific examples of that bypassing before I give?
Like folks will use meditation as a way to try to enforce this performative calmness or
Yeah.
wisdom, or and you have such a wonderful relationship to emotions as
Yeah.
part of the Dharma. So yeah.
Exactly. Thank you. Yes, and I haven't seen the second season yet. I work very slowly through shows. So I still watch shows that are like 40, 30 years old, like the Golden Girls. It's just like if it was on the 70s and the 80s, I'm still watching them like they're still, happening. But I have to get I know. I know. I only watched White Lotus because I didn't want people to spoil it for me. So I had to keep up with it. But Severance, I've talked a lot about Severance too, because I've used Severance to talk about the ways in which enlightened beings descend into this realm and the severance that happens, the loss of memory, because it has to happen, right? So the awakened self and the more relative self. And I've used that to help people to understand some of the choices that awakened teachers, realized teachers make in relationship to their humanity, because they're not completely online, and you can't be completely online in a dream, right? So that's that's another thing. But the bypassing, absolutely, the performative piece, which is just really conflict avoidance, right? The ways in which we take on these practices and dharma, but there's no depth, no understanding of that, you know. And yeah, it becomes performative, it becomes silencing, it becomes erasing for people, and that creates more harm, you know. Silence is a big part of the culture, right? And that's something that many people struggle with, right? Because silence is weaponized against us to keep us from having certain interactions, certain conversations, right? Silence is also very triggering for those of us who grew up in communities where silence indicated violence happening. You know, like people get real quiet when something's about to go down. Right? Like in the lunchroom in high school, it was like when everyone got really silent, everyone was like, where's the fight? It was like the second before things started happening. But it's the second before people start running on the street. I've been in that. I've been in a situation where being in a public place and someone was suspected of shooting, and like that silence and then the explosion of like panic, right? And so we have to take into account, the ways in which like these practices aren't universally peaceful and authentic, depending on where you grew up and how you grew up, which is developmental adolescent trauma, right? So yeah, I mean, how is that, in terms like how does that land? And you can, yeah, I'm gonna make sure I get into it.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. But to maybe clarify my question a little bit, for you folks who are coming into Buddhist practices, I think sometimes a lot of us are coming in and we're curious, we're exploring. And so sometimes I think our first brush with Buddhism is a kind of caricature of itself,
Yeah.
of the monk, of the
yeah.
of the silent, like you're saying. So, particularly, could you talk about suffering and the way that this practice is not meant to cut yourself off from suffering like they do in Severance,
Oh, yeah.
but instead to sit with it?
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the piece for sure. Yeah. The practice is about being in a relationship with the discomfort. That's Buddhism. And what it looks like is severance, detachment, renunciation, right? Because our idea of a practitioner is a monastic, right? Which is extreme, but traditional. Like that's traditionally how many communities still honor and practice Buddhism is through the monastic institution. But that's not the sole representation of a practitioner. We have the householder tradition, right, which most of us are, householder practitioners. That means that we are living and working and raising families, but we're also practitioners. And that comes with the level of conflict as well. But the severance, getting back to the severance piece, yeah, I think it's aligned with spiritual materialism, with assimilation culture. It's like we're going to pick the thing that makes us feel comfortable and just roll with it, instead of like practicing the depths of these practices, which is real engagement with suffering and changing our relationship to suffering, not skipping over it, or cutting it off. So it's not going to feel great at the beginning, but I say when we let go of resisting suffering, then there's a lot of space that opens up, right? But it's not what we thought it was, So how's that? Is that helpful? Yeah. Yeah. But we're trying to, as the mic is being passed, we're trying to create wholeness. That's what love is. When I say you have to love everything, that means I want to bring everything, even the things that I don't like, into community with me, right? Because we can't get free, we can't reduce suffering if we keep splitting ourselves up into pieces and hiding pieces away and saying, I don't want to deal with that. So how do we bring everything? How do we love everything? Which is to say, how do we accept everything and bring everything back into a wholeness so that we can be with both the pleasure and the displeasure, holding those equally, because that's the mind of equality, right? Not equality, that's equanimity. The practice of equanimity. It's like holding everything equally in the same space, not pushing away one thing, not grabbing onto anything, but saying, okay, here we go. It is what it is, right? And that's what love is. It's bringing all of that together. You can't get free in pieces. Oh, absolutely. Oh, we'll do Cheryl next.
Let's do the online person first, and then Cheryl's okay to go next. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm huge. Hi. Lama Rod, first, I just want to thank you. I've been around you in many ways and studied with you mostly online. And I have a question that I want, and it's about benefactor practice and how you talk about it in more of a Unitarian Universalist context, because what I find in teaching in the Unitarian world is it's a little of what the person before me said, is that it's not exactly bypassing, it's literally fear that a lot of people have come into our tradition because they have been harmed or they've rejected something from their other tradition. And so when I'm trying to be as authentic as I can, I can't just, I struggle sometimes with talking about this is really about liberation. This is really about embracing everything. And so I've really worked with benefactor practice a lot, but I just want to say something specifically to you, personal for me.
What was growth? Oh
The
yeah, I told you. I told
somebody's when we speak about the realm of refuge, and you talk about coming home in love and rage, one of the things that people see is they've always had benefactors. They've always been around them. I had this experience of going to Harvard Divinity School to see my friend Josh, a very strong Vajrayana practitioner who was doing an MDiv at Harvard. And I was in, I think it was a dorm or the library or something. And there was this young Black guy. And wherever I was waiting for Josh, he was there. And it's you.
Josh Bryant.
Josh Bryant, yes.
Yeah, I remember you.
Yes. And
I was thinking, I was like, Josh. I
Yeah.
remember Josh would have visitors.
I did.
Yeah.
I know. I did Continuum and all the somatic stuff with Josh.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And bottom line is that you are a benefactor for me. I call you in a lot. And I was so excited that you were coming into our Unitarian Universalist world. And I just so thank you. But I want to know, like, how do you talk about benefactor practice? I feel like it's where I start coming out, is really talking about this realm that supports me when I'm freaked out, when I'm scared, all of the things we've talked about, in the last day and a half.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I remember that. I don't remember the details, but I do remember you, Josh. That day.
Josh.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't seen in a bit, but we pass messages to each other from other friends. But yeah, it's funny because we're currently doing a certification course in our benefactor practice, which is called the Seven Homecomings practice, which I talk about in Love and Rage. And I introduced that practice as my expression of benefactor practice. And I learned benefactor practice from Lama John McCransky many years ago when he first started teaching benefactor practice. And we would get these one sheet papers and in retreat. And he was like, this is something I'm thinking about, and we would have to train in that. So I took benefactor practice. So benefactor practice is a metta loving kindness. It's the same tradition of practice. And metta, traditionally, you use phrases to cultivate, to awaken the state of being deeply loved and cared for. In benefactor practice, you're calling in benefactors, other beings, to offer that care, that love to you, right? And so Lama John would teach the single benefactor practice. But in the Seven Homecomings practice, I say call in as many beings as you can. And I have categories of beings, teachers, guides, community, and so forth. And they come and they gather in a circle around you and they radiate the energy of care. And we go through a series of exercises. Mm-hmm. You visualize it. Oh yeah, no, you don't. Well, it could, and there are ways that could happen, but it won't be all the beings in the universe. But no, there's no difference. Like one person can embody all the love in the universe, for you. But you visualize getting all these beings together and loving you. And then there's a series of different extensions of the practice, which you share the energy. You do healing work. We often do this in Medicine Buddha on Monday nights as well. But anyway, that's the practice, right? And so when we talk about benefactor practice, and you're talking about people, right, who as you mentioned, people with significant religious trauma who are coming to take refuge in our communities, right? And I think benefactor practice is a way that we start reconnecting to, or actually discovering perhaps for the first time, what it means to be deeply tended to and cared for. And the initial stages of those practices means that like we're using this energy from our benefactors to really heal a lot of woundedness, right? And sitting and experiencing what it feels like to be unconditionally cared for and loved, right? And you can stay with that, as Lama John would talk about, that first stage of receiving for many years, right? Because most of us are actually quite wounded around love. Love has been deeply weaponized against many of us, and that's created traumas. And that's certainly things that I had to work through in the practice early on, right? So yeah, so it's learning how to really trust and open to receiving deep care, right? And I train people in this technique. I don't think it's much to train in, but people tend to want to be trained in it. And we're currently in a course training folks, but we have ongoing practice groups that I have people who train with me lead online. So if you're interested in sitting in on a group like that, just email my website and we will send you a list of ongoing practice leaders offering this in different time zones, online. Yeah. And this is something, again, that comes out of my practice. This is a practice that came out of Natural Dharma Fellowship in those years. Grace, you were part of those early days of like me working through the setup of this practice, because it comes out of refuge, right? Taking refuge, right? And I said, okay, what else do we take refuge in besides the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha? And then I started thinking about ancestors and lineages and the earth and silence. And ultimately, we're taking refuge in ourselves because we have to. That's part of the condition of liberation. I have to come home to myself. And I call it the 7 homecomings because it's trying to create the conditions to feel at home, to come home, right? To our bodies, to the earth, to the teachers, and so forth, right? So again, that's in Love and Rage. And if you want to explore more, just reach out to us for practice groups. Okay. All right, Cheryl.
Okay, funny, strange question. A combat veteran, point 1.
Oh, you're a combat veteran?
Yes.
Okay.
From Vietnam. When I was doing activism in the 80s, there were a handful of us that were former combat veterans. We were less scared than most people to deal with things. And being on a protest line in dresses, we got beat up by the cops a lot. Okay. So here I am being called back to really radical activism again. And what I'm struggling with is I'm sitting here with 2 sets of vows, my tantric vows as a householder and my relaxed monastic vows. And I was told, do not put yourself in harm's way. And then I'm trying to reconcile this because it's very necessary. There's not many people like the people I ran with and run with that can go out there and be fearless about this stuff. But here I am, I'm bound by my vows. How do I justify this? I'm trying to be a compassionate person and go out there and do the right thing.
Well, it depends on what you really want. Do you really want to be on the front lines right now?
I'm 73 years old next week. Not really. But
well,
when does that stop you? If it's really necessary, if you've got the, excuse the expression, cojones to do it, do it. Somebody has to stand up and take a stand.
Yes.
And that's the issue.
And is that your work still as an elder?
That's what I'm questioning.
Yeah. I have my opinion. Which one do you want? You want my opinion? Do you want a dharmic response?
No, I'd like an opinion.
Yeah, I think that your work isn't at the front lines anymore
Okay.
because you hold the role of elder in the community, and part of eldership is actually surviving
Okay.
because you
Carry the
hold,
knowledge.
yeah, you have the knowledge, the history, the wisdom that has to be transmitted.
Okay.
Like we can't lose you without that being passed on. And that's what I fear about elders taking up certain kinds of work right now.
Okay.
You know, because you're not the first. I have many elders who are just like, do I need to be back out on the front lines? And I say no, because there are all these young people. Right? That's what we do. Like the young people take up the front lines. Like we hold space, we mentor. Well, you. I don't consider myself necessarily an elder, but elders have to like hold space in a different way, and there are different forms of activism that are needed right now. But I also believe that activism has to be different. You know, like this is a different situation. So this isn't something we can organize our way out of. This is something that has to collapse. Because we keep reforming, and that's been the problem. We keep reforming a system that has never worked, right? And finally, we have to let things collapse, and from the collapse, we start rebuilding.
I'm a former journalist, so it may be time for the elder to pick
Yeah.
up the sword of the pen again and go after it that way.
I hope that you write your story down because there are too many people who are leaving. Everyone can't be Angela Davis.
Yeah.
You know, like your autobiography is like the book, like, but so many people have to leave something. Like you have to leave a record of what you've done so that we continue to learn. Right. But it's also part of the generation, it's also for the younger generations to learn how to honor the wisdom of the ancestors and the wisdom of the elders.
Okay.
And the ancestors as well. But the living elders have to be recognized for what they've offered. And let me just make this clear, an elder isn't someone who's old. Right? It's someone who has experienced a lot and who is actively sharing those experiences and training people and holding space for younger folks to do work. Like eldership is active, it's not just circumstantial. Right? It's not just because you're old, it's because you are actively engaging and educating and holding, you know, and healing and so forth. Yeah.
Mentoring too.
Yeah, mentoring.
I get it. Thank you.
One more question over here, one more here, we got 5 minutes. Right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
This is a quick follow on, Lama Rod. So you just said that there are many ways for activism. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about is actually the power of a meditation that is not inward looking, which is important, but is outward looking and is actually intended to actively engage with the quantum world, the unseen world to affect change. Can you talk about whether you have a practice that is specifically geared toward holding people that we would rather not hold, but that but need to? That is, if our belief is that we're all interconnected, then that means we have to not only take some responsibility for what is happening now, which we so don't want to do. However, we don't get to be interconnected when everything is beautiful. We are interconnected, so we have had some role in where we are today. But that kind of activism, sitting on the mat, using the power, right, of our meditation and our mindfulness to affect change. Do you?
Well, yeah, and that's important to unpack more. It's like, yeah, we have this practice of sitting on the cushion, looking inward, and sometimes I think this is what you're pointing to. Sometimes it stops there, and that's not engaged, right? Engaged Buddhism happens when we take that practice off the cushion and we begin to apply this wisdom in the world. We start making decisions about how to disrupt, right? To abolish the systems, the institutions that get in the way of us getting free. You know? Hmm? Oh, yeah, specific practice. So, yeah. Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Like, yeah, if there's like a real limitation there, right? It's like, then what are other ways that we can divest in our personal life? You know, these small things, right? That may be very personal for us, but it's still a divestment from being wrapped up in perpetuating these systems, right? You know, and that means maybe, I mean, the small things are like boycotts, you know, but like there's a real value to having a voice online too that people can use. Um, and the ways in which we're able to hold people in a lot of care and compassion just in our interactions with folks. I think one of the main practices, of course, is compassion. For me, compassion contextualizes people. When I say contextualize, this is a main practice of mine. I talk about this in the New Saints. I have a practice specifically for the contemplation of difficult people. You know, and that practice is basically actually asking us to really think about, to reflect on all the ways in which this person has been shaped by harm. You know, and so when we're having problems with people, and we often make it about ourselves, about us, we make it very personal, but instead in the practice, I'm like, well, have you considered what this person has survived in their life? That the conflict that we're having, maybe it's not about our relationship, but maybe they're just in a lot of suffering, and this is the best that they can do, like in our relationship, right? Because it's not always about us, right? This contextualization helps me move through the world, really humanizing people. Like people aren't just these evil beings who just believe in whatever they believe in. They're people who have been shaped by the causes and conditions that we all are having to survive every day. And we all have access to different tools and resources. I was very fortunate to be born into a family where I received a lot of care and a lot of love and a deep sense of safety. And I am in a relationship with people who didn't get that. Right. And that's created a different relationship with those people. Right. And so that understanding really softens our heart. But some of us don't want to get soft. We want to hold on to our grudges and our anger because it makes us feel powerful. You know, and we don't want to feel weak. Right. But that's systemic things. You know, weakness is always aligned with the people that are most oppressed. And then we kind of unconsciously realize that we're a part of that oppression, right? So we don't want to deal with that. So this is very complicated here, you know? When we humanize people and contextualize people, that means that like we become very clear about the ways in which we may have been a part of their, you know, their wellness, their suffering, or what have you, right? And the gentleness and the care that comes with that for us has to be really clear, right? You don't sit around, like guilt isn't productive, but saying, okay, this is what I've engaged in, and how do I change that moving forward? That's productive. How do I change? This is what the practice should be doing. It should be changing us. We shouldn't just be static in this place that feels really good. Like we should always be asking ourselves, how do I change? How do I evolve? How do I grow? Where's the suffering at? If you're not suffering, then you're bypassing it, right? It doesn't mean that you should just be miserable all the time because that's not what the practice is asking us to do. The practice is asking us to be in relationship to discomfort. That doesn't mean that we're overwhelmed by discomfort because again, as we talked about this morning, space is holding everything. So space helps me to be in relationship to discomfort, you know. So I know we have one last question. Oh yeah, Chris.
Yes, you had you mentioned a lot last night about the importance of being resourced, especially as, wanting to be a bodhisattva. So could you speak a little bit more about that? I know you referred a little bit tonight.
Yeah. Yeah. And I write about self-care, particularly more in depth in New Saints as well. So I'll try to reference, as I've been doing, where I talk about more of these things in my books. But being a bodhisattva doesn't mean that we're like depleted. Like, I think we talked about this last night. Liberation work comes from a place of being deeply resourced. You need resources to get free. Liberation takes energy, right? Like, why would you meditate exhausted? Yeah. And that's the brutality of the system that keeps us exhausted. And so you have to disrupt the ways in which systems are depleting us and reclaim rest. I think about Trisha Hersey, who's a friend of mine, who we call her the NAP, the Ministry of NAP, the bishop, the NAP bishop, who's in Atlanta as well. And her work is about how rest is a part of our activism. Because that's really rooted in what Audre Lorde taught, which is that, self-care is political warfare because systems control us and annihilate us through exhaustion. You can't disrupt and divest if you're tired. You just go along with everything. And that's why one of the ways fascism arises, because people are so tired and distracted. They're just like, okay, just let this person make decisions. I don't care. Whatever, as long as it doesn't impact me. And that's going to be the downfall of fascism in this country because it's going to impact everyone, right? And that's when people start getting real active and saying, well, this wasn't supposed to affect me. Yeah, it's like, this wasn't for me, but no. And that's when you'll see real change happening in this country. Like, there are too many people still very comfortable, and that's not going to last long. But yes, so self-care has to be practiced in a way that we are saying, these are the resources that I need to be well and resourced, and I'm only engaging these resources because I want to have the energy to do the work that's important. I'm not engaging in self-care because I just want to feel good or like I would just want to overindulge, right? I need to feel resourced in order to do the real hard labor. You can't do hard labor without resources. And that's what we're trying to do. You have to rest, you have to eat, you have to be with, in community, it's whatever, wherever your resources are. And we have to gather those resources at the same time knowing that there are others who don't have access to those resources. And I do that. I make that choice to engage in my resources because I say, listen, like I am taking these resources on behalf of those who do not have access to those resources. But I go even further. I engage in self-care also on behalf of my ancestors who did not have access to this care, right? Who are still in many ways depleted, right? Because it's not, again, as we were talking about this morning, it's not just about us. I am practicing on behalf of many beings, including formless beings who rely on me, right? So as I am resourced, that creates like a resourcefulness for my ancestors as they live through me, right? I'm doing what they couldn't do, and that helps them to feel resourced, right? As if for those of you who are parents, don't you feel better when your kids or grandkids or nieces and nephews and so forth, don't you feel better when they have what they need? In the same way, our ancestors feel better when we have what our ancestors feel better when we have what we need, right? And so that's an important way to look at this, right? But you ask yourself, what do you need, right? And how do you gather what you need? Not what you want. Like we want a lot of things. That's overconsumption, right? But what do you need to be well? And that's very individual for all of us. I think there are basic things like food, rest, water, basic necessities. But what else helps you to do the work that's important, Like if you're an activist, what do you need to really show up? Community. I think that's one of the biggest things. We don't want to feel alone. We can't get free alone, right? We spiritual community is important in terms of like moving along the greater part of the path, but liberation itself, like ultimate liberation, is a very personal experience, right? But we get to the threshold of awakening, and that's something we just have to do on our own. We have to move across that threshold. That means we give up everything. You know, even the desire to get free, we have to give up at the very end, right? But you're moving with the community, life after life. Like everyone in this room, we've been together, I believe, many times over and over and over again in different capacities. And some of us maybe be praying to get transferred to another group. At least I did when I was in my 3-year retreat program. You know, it was the 4 of us. And my teacher would be like, you realize you've done this many times before. To have this extreme, intense spiritual experience for years, that means that you've done this many times before. And I guarantee you, I swear by the end of that retreat, I was like, where do I put in a transfer request? Like, I can't do this again. Like, I need like a break from these people, you know? That's what community does. They surface all the places you need to work on. You know, if your community doesn't hold conflicts and open to conflict, it's not a real spiritual community. You're bypassing. Conflict has to be surfaced in order to hold conflict with care and love and deeper understanding. It doesn't mean that you're going to like everyone. I'm in community with people that I don't like, but we're about the same thing, about getting free, you know? And so that's fine. You know, liking someone is so subjective. It's like, I don't like them because I don't like the color lipstick that they wear. So that just kind of rubs me the wrong way. I mean, it gets real frivolous. Like that. And so you have to disregard liking and say, okay, are we on the same page? Do we have the same goals? Or can we show up for each other? I can still show up for someone that I don't like. But that doesn't mean I'm hanging out with them and they're not being invited, you know, to my parties or whatever. It's just like, we're not going to do that. But I'm there just to love you and support you because we're doing the same work. Okay. Okay, sounds good. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Yeah.